Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weep Union, and in this one we start out in the direction of Vuhledar, where the Russians continue their fight over the city. The fighting continues within the city itself in the eastern parts of it, and the Russians also storming the western parts, where they have managed to capture the fortified position and the road here west of Vuhledar, and they continue their operations to envelop the Ukrainian positions here north of Vuhledar. As expected, the Russians developed offensive operations across the river line to reach the roads of supply here for Vuhledar, and they've managed to capture one of the remaining ones, to the point that there is only one which in such close proximity to the front line that Russia now has fire control over the road, which means Vuhledar is now operationally encircled. We're likely going to see a withdrawal of the Ukrainian soldiers south of the city towards the city itself to enter it and adapt to the positions within it and prevent or slow down the Russian advance, or a potential withdrawal from the remaining road, which again is within fire control of the Russian forces. This means any withdrawal will take heavy casualties, so it is likely they'll make a last stand or surrender instead, as a withdrawal would be too costly. The battle over the city is reaching its end, however, it is far from ending. The city itself, as we can see, is a set of high-rise apartment complex buildings, and the ones that were built during the Soviet time, such as this one, are very well built in the sense that it is almost completely indestructible. We have some footage of the fighting here in the direction of Vuhledar, such as this one, where we see the heavy bombing that takes place, but we also see that these buildings, they are still standing. Despite over 2 years of heavy shelling, the buildings are still standing and the Ukrainians are still using them as defensive positions. Whenever these strikes begin, they go into the basements, they go into safer areas, and then as soon as the bombardment ends, they go back up to reposition themselves. This means that what we're currently seeing is that the Russians launch massive barrages to hit the Ukrainian positions, and they time it so that as soon as it's about to end, they start pushing in the direction of the Ukrainian positions so that they catch them while they are on their way back up from the basements, in a sense. And that is very reminiscent of World War I trench warfare tactics, where artillery barrages would keep the soldiers in the trenches, and the attacking force is moving towards the trenches during this period because they are free from any sort of counterfire from the ones in the trenches, since they're going into their bunkers. Therefore, we see that the situation is that the Russians are heavily relying on the artillery in a World War I style, where they keep the Ukrainians in the basements and then they storm their positions while doing so. To the west of Vuhledar, the Russians have also advanced here north of Prishestivka as they expand their zone of control and their foothold across the river line. At the same time, they've captured two massive fortified positions of the Ukrainians north of it and are storming the next ones south of Novokrainka. The Ukrainians do not have a lot of fortified positions remaining south of Novokrainka, so based on this, we see that the Russians continue their offensive operations and will not stop at Vuhledar. If we take a look at the topographic map, we see that the city of Vuhledar is located at an elevation of 189 meters, and we see that this height elevation continues here to the east of Novokrainka. The Ukrainian fortified positions south of Novokrainka are located at 194 meters. The town itself is located at 177 meters, and to the north of it, it is yet again 190 meters. Vovchansk itself is located in the low ground, the same with the village chain here along the river line west of Konstantinivka. So we see that the Russians' objective is to take control over Vuhledar, which is the only high ground in this entire area, to advance from Vuhledar through to Novokrainka along the heights, where they can then storm Vuhledar and Novokrainka from the high ground. Currently, they're fighting an uphill battle against the Ukrainian fortified positions near Novokrainka. They crossed over the river line here by Prishestivka, capturing the initial fortified positions located on 168 meters. Then they are fighting against the Ukrainian fortified positions at 146 meters, after which they will fight the next line, third line of defense, which is located at 190 meters. So it's likely that the Russians will not fight the third line, We'll instead focus on the second line to gain control over the northern flank of Brzezinska, preventing a Ukrainian counterattack, and then advance from Vuhledar towards Novoukrayinka and Bohoyavlenka. And this is exactly why Vuhledar is so important. If we take a look, we can see that with the capture of Vuhledar, there are several directions the Russians can take and advance through to attack against Ukrainian fortified positions located at a lower elevation. We see Kurahova in the north. It is located at 140 meters. Just north of it, there's a high ground of 177 meters. Vuhledar itself is located at 190 meters. Novoukrayinka itself is located at 177. Bohoyavlenka at 134. The entire chain here is located at much lower ground, Velika Novosilka at 110 meters. So generally the Russians can advance and have the high ground this entire time. It is similar to the capture of Ocheretine. We see that Ocheretine is located on the high ground. Following the capture of it, the Russians advanced in every single direction from the high ground towards the low ground positions. This allowed them to continue the offensive operations along the high ground as long as the high ground continued. And now they have captured Novhrodivka. They are all the way down to Hrynik after capturing Ukrainsk. So we see that the high ground advantage is exactly what the Russians are prioritizing for the offensive operations. And just south of it, we see a similar case where the Russians will have the high ground, the only high ground in the area, and take advantage of that capture to then push towards these lower ground positions. Based on this, we can see that the Russians will, if they capture Vuhledar, push towards Novoukrayinka, Bohoyavlenka, and then continue along this high ground positions towards the Ukrainian villages in this area right here, after which they'll storm the low ground positions such as Velika Novosilka and other towns as they continue pushing along the river lines here to the northeast of Vuhledar. Further north here in the direction of the pocket northwest of Krasnohorivka, about half of it has been captured by the Russians as they now control the road between Krasnohorivka and Shelane Druhe. With this, the Russians can strengthen their offensive operations to capture the remaining parts here across the river line and from Shelane Druhe to then push towards Soriane and down towards Oleksandropil. So we'll likely see operations from these three separate directions, from Krasnohorivka itself towards Soriane, from Shelane Druhe towards Soriane, and from Hostre towards Oleksandropil. The objective of these operations is to gain full control over the eastern bank of the Vovcha river line, all the way down south to Kurahove, and to then push from the flank of Kurahove, rather from the southern direction, fighting it head on. They'll be attacking from the eastern positions, where they'll be flanking the Ukrainian positions there. Naturally, it is logical to believe that the Ukrainians would have expanded these fortified positions to cover the northern flank as well as soon as they saw the Russians advancing in the northern parts. So it's likely that they will be building new fortified positions, but it will not be at the level of the fortified positions they have to the south of Kurahove, which have been built for many, many years now. Here to the south of Konstantinivka, the Russians have expanded to gain full control of the road between Konstantinivka and Vuhledar. And at the same time, the north, the Russians have secured further positions west of Ukrainsk and are fighting towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians just east of Sukharine, after which they'll be attacking from three separate directions towards the mine area here to the southeast of Sukharine to gain control of fortified positions and storm Sukharine from the east as well as from the north. In the next section of the front line here in the direction of Vovchansk, the Ukrainians have managed to recapture the Aggregate plant. Here we see this footage here of the Ukrainians have released of the recapture of the Aggregate plant. We see the complete destruction of the Aggregate plant from the heavy shelling, and generally there is no seen Russian positions. In this entire video, we don't see a single Russian soldier. We see some shelling of different positions, and then we see the GRU celebrating, and then more firefighting, shooting into empty rooms. There's not a single POW, there's not a single dead person, there's nothing. Simply some what looks like PR video that was filmed after the recapture of the Aggregate plant. This means one of two things: either the Russians withdrew from the aggregate plant to their behind positions, their rear positions, or the Russians simply kept fighting until that none of them were left. We see that, according to Ukraine reports, there were 400 soldiers in the aggregate plant, therefore holding out for 4 months in this sort of situation. It makes sense that they couldn't hold out for much longer than what they already have. Now we have this image here from some footage over Vovchansk that was very recent, and we see that the blue lining is the new front line, and the Russian positions I have circled under with a half circle in the red color. And based on this footage, we can see how destroyed Vovchansk is. The aggregate plant is still somewhat standing, although the majority of the windows are blown out, the massive holes within the buildings, but they are still standing. There are a few other buildings still standing, but for all of the regular residential buildings, they are all completely wrecked to the ground. So based on this, we can see that Vovchansk is a very difficult position to have a lot of soldiers and to hold on to, and it'll just become even more difficult now that they've lost the aggregate plant. Therefore, we can assume that the Ukrainians will likely recapture the remaining parts of Vovchansk unless the Russians launch a new offensive here in the Kharkiv direction, either to cross the river or to expand the front line. In either case, Vovchansk, it is very difficult to defend much more of this, so whoever is under offensive will likely capture more of it. In turn, we do know that the Russians have been spending these 4 months to build fortified positions north of Vovchansk, so it could be that they will then withdraw to these fortified positions that they have built in the northern flank of Vovchansk and just leave the town to go to these fortified positions. However, again, it'll just be another battle of attrition, as the Ukrainians, if they continue their offensive operations, will be able to push the Russians out eventually due to the small area that the Russians are actually holding on to. It is comparable to the Kursk direction, although the area by Kharkiv is more fortified. The Kursk direction is more open fields, and therefore the Russians have an easier time recapturing these fortified positions, and we see that with the constant advance by the Russians as soon as they started their counteroffensive, and the constant advance of the Ukrainians once they started their own offensive here in the Kursk direction. The Russians have managed to recapture positions here between Borki and Plechovo as they start the operations to storm the town itself here on the bank of the Sela River, but the objective of the Russians is to push the Ukrainians back beyond the river line and regain control over it to then strengthen their counterattack operations in the direction of Sucha itself, where they'll be looking to regain control over the town here in the central parts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out our Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.